Every morning, before the sun could warm the cracked sidewalks of the old quarter, he was already there, the man with the graying beard and eyes like weathered stone. He sat quietly against the side wall of Sophie's little diner, his coat threadbare, his shoes more whole than leather. He never begged. He never spoke, only nodded politely at those who passed, as if offering a silent apology for existing. Sophie had noticed him the first week she opened her diner, the Golden Fork, a name her late mother had loved. She was young, maybe too young to be running a business alone, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet fire. The kind that didn't shout but didn't waver either. While others dismissed the man as another shadow among many, she saw something different in him. Not pity, but a certain stillness, like the silence of a deep forest. On the third morning, she brought him a cup of warm tea and a sandwich wrapped carefully in parchment. She said nothing as she placed them beside him, only offered a small smile before returning to her duties inside. The man looked down at the food, then up at her, and for the briefest moment, something shimmered behind those weather-beaten eyes, something unspoken, almost reverent. He nodded once slowly. She nodded back. And so it continued. Every day. A quiet ritual between two people who never exchanged names, never shared their stories.
She gave.
He received. And the world passed by, too busy, too loud, to notice the sacredness of the act. Customers occasionally scoffed. "He's just lazy," one man muttered. "Feeding him's just encouraging more of them," another said. But Sophie never responded with anger. Her voice, when she spoke, was always soft, almost wistful. "I don't give him food because he needs it," she said once, wiping down a table near the window. "I give it because I don't want to lose the part of myself that still sees him." Outside, the man never moved much. He read old papers he found in bins, sometimes stared at the sky like it whispered secrets only he could hear. He would always wait until Sophie wasn't looking to touch the food, as if accepting kindness too directly might break something fragile. There was something strangely grounding about his presence. Amid the clatter of dishes, the stress of bills, and the ache of loneliness that sometimes crept into Sophie's chest during slow afternoons, just knowing he was out there, silent, constant, made the world feel a little less indifferent. She never asked his name. He never asked for hers. But in a way that language could never contain, they knew each other.
And that was enough. For now.
It didn't take long for whispers to gather like smoke in the corners of the diner. By the end of the second week, Sophie began to notice the shift in the air. It was subtle at first, a pause in conversation when she passed by, a side glance, a hesitant question. Then came the more direct remarks. Some customers, the kind who believed that decency should be conditional, made sure their opinions were heard. "You know he's probably a junkie," one woman sneered over her morning coffee, stirring in too much sugar like it could sweeten her words. "He's been sitting out there for weeks." "Isn't that bad for business?" said another man, more concerned about appearances than people. One regular, a banker who always smelled of cologne and complaints, leaned in one afternoon and muttered, "This isn't charity, it's a diner. You're not a saint, Sophie." But Sophie would just smile, not politely, but with that quiet defiance only those who have suffered can wear gracefully. Her hands never stopped moving, wiping counters, pouring coffee, carrying plates with practiced rhythm. But behind her eyes, a storm brewed, not of anger, but of sorrow, for how quickly the world forgets that dignity has no price tag. She wanted to shout sometimes, wanted to ask them, "What do you really know about struggle? About silence? About a man who asks for nothing, but gives you the gift of reminding you that compassion still matters?" But she never did. Instead, she stood firmer. The sandwich she brought him grew warmer, the tea stronger, and she added a folded napkin each time, because something about that simple gesture, treating him like any other customer, felt right, felt human. She began to notice how often the regulars would glance outside when they thought she wasn't looking. They were watching him too, the quiet man with nothing to his name but a coat and a silence deeper than most prayers. And sometimes, just sometimes, their stares softened. Doubt flickered. Curiosity crept in. Sophie clung to those tiny shifts like seeds of hope. She remembered what her mother used to say on cold winter nights. Being kind when it's easy means nothing. Kindness matters most when it costs you. And it was costing her. Some customers stopped coming altogether. A supplier once mentioned, offhandedly, that rumors were spreading, that her diner was becoming a haven for the homeless. The words stung, but they didn't shake her. Every morning, before unlocking the door, she'd glance toward the wall where he always sat. If he was there, she felt anchored. If not, a subtle ache bloomed beneath her ribs until she saw him again. And when she brought out his food, placed it gently beside him with a silent nod, she was no longer doing it out of habit. She was doing it out of faith. Faith that, even in a world drowning in cynicism, one act of steady goodness could matter. She never knew what battles he had fought. Never knew what had led him to the streets. But she knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that treating him as invisible would have made her no different than the world that had already cast him aside. So she kept feeding him, kept choosing grace. Even when the whispers turned into judgments and the judgments into warnings. Because Sophie wasn't just feeding a man. She was feeding her own belief that somewhere beneath the noise of profit and pretense, the heart of the world still beat. Quietly, stubbornly, and without apology. The rain had been relentless that week, soaking the sidewalks and turning the streets into slow-moving rivers. Sophie still brought the man his meal each morning, her shoes damp, her apron clinging to her frame from the mist. The cold crept into her bones, but she wore warmth in her gestures, in the way she laid the napkin gently beside him, in the way her eyes still searched his face for something, anything, that might tell her he was okay. He never said much. A nod, sometimes a half-smile. That was all. But it was enough to keep her going. Until the morning he didn't come. She waited. Not just that morning, but the next. Then the next. She brought the sandwich anyway, left it wrapped and warm in the usual spot. But the seat remained empty. His coat, his silence, his presence, gone, like a name forgotten by the wind. A strange hollowness settled in her chest. She kept working, kept smiling. But the rhythm was broken. Her kindness had been a small defiance against the cruelty of the world, and now it felt as if the world had won. And then it got worse. It happened 3 nights later. The sound shattered her sleep first, a violent crash, like glass screaming. She ran down the stairs barefoot, heart pounding, and froze at the doorway. The diner was in ruin. Windows smashed. Chairs overturned. The register torn open, though there was barely anything inside. The walls that once echoed with warmth and music now dripped with malice. Spray paint hissed its message in jagged, angry lines. Feed the bums, lose the business. Sophie's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, shards of glass biting her palms. The rain seeped through the broken windows, turning the linoleum floor into a pool of gray. She wept, not just for the damage, not for the money, not even for the fear, but for the cruelty that could burn down something good, simply because it didn't understand it. The police came, took photos, asked questions. But she could see it in their eyes. They thought she brought this on herself. The homeless man, the stubborn kindness, the rumors. It all added up too neatly for them. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat like splinters. All she could do was nod. Nod as they left. Nod as the silence settled again. By morning, the news had already made its rounds. Small-town diner vandalized in suspected hate crime. They used her name, showed photos of her hugging volunteers, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the diner. Her father's legacy, her soul's refuge, lay in pieces. The regulars came that day, hesitant and sheepish, offering condolences wrapped in awkward silence. Some brought flowers. Others just stared. No one mentioned him. No one asked about the man she fed. It was like he had never existed. Sophie sat behind the counter, her hands motionless for the first time in weeks. The air was heavy with ash and dust, and in that moment, something inside her gave way. The strength she'd carried like a shield cracked. She had held on to faith when others scoffed. She had believed in dignity, in quiet kindness. But now, all she had left was a mess of broken glass and silence. And for the first time since he disappeared, she said his name aloud. Not because she ever knew it, but because she had to call out something into the emptiness, even if there was no answer. "Why did you leave?" she whispered. "Where are you now?" But the rain only kept falling.
Cold.
Indifferent. And Sophie, who had stood so tall for so long, finally let herself collapse, not in defeat, but in mourning for a goodness that felt too fragile to survive this world. 3 days passed since the diner fell silent. Sophie hadn't opened the doors again. She stayed inside, cleaning what little she could, replaying every moment with the man, his silence, his eyes, the way he'd hold the sandwich with a quiet dignity as though it were a royal gift. She began to question whether any of it had been real, whether kindness, in the end, was worth it at all. It was nearly dusk when it happened. The sound of tires on gravel outside didn't register at first. But then came the faint thud of a car door, followed by the sharp knock on glass, 3 times, clear and steady. Sophie looked up from the floor, where she'd been scraping dried ketchup from a booth. Outside, parked in front of the shattered remains of the diner's facade, was a black limousine. She stared, not moving. The last thing she expected in this ghost town of a moment was something so sleek, so foreign, so impossibly out of place. The door opened. A tall man stepped out. It took her a second to recognize him. He wore a charcoal gray coat now, tailored and immaculate. His posture had changed, no longer hunched and small, but tall, composed, and quietly powerful. His beard was still there, though trimmed. His eyes, however, were exactly the same, tired, knowing, carrying more lifetimes than one man should. It was him, the man she had fed, but he was no longer the man the world had mocked. Sophie stumbled toward the door, unlocked it with trembling hands, and stepped out into the fading light. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp.
He spoke first.
"I'm sorry I disappeared," he said, voice low, rough, but no longer cracked by hardship. "I had to disappear, to return properly." She stared, breath shallow, unsure whether to feel anger, confusion, or awe. "I don't understand," she whispered. He smiled, not arrogantly, but with a tenderness that reached all the way back to those quiet mornings on the bench. "My name is Elliot Brand," he said. "I used to be CEO of a company you've probably heard of. I walked away from all of it 3 years ago after a personal tragedy and found that the world had no place for someone grieving, someone broken." Sophie's mouth parted, but no words came. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. A tech empire, a billionaire recluse, vanished mysteriously after the death of his wife and daughter in a plane crash. He had become a myth, tabloid fodder and speculation. But he had not disappeared to a private island or a foreign palace. He had been here, on her street, on her bench. "You didn't treat me like a ghost," Elliot continued. "You didn't look away. You didn't ask for my story or judge my silence. You just gave, without expecting anything." Tears blurred Sophie's eyes. She felt suddenly small, not because she was unimportant, but because something immense had happened and she hadn't even known it. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He looked around at the wrecked diner, the broken glass, now glinting gold under the setting sun. "Because this place is real," he said. "Because what you did, feeding someone no one else saw, that's the kind of world I want to believe in again." He stepped aside and gestured. From the back of the limousine, 2 assistants emerged, one carrying blueprints, the other holding a leather case. "I want to rebuild it," Elliot said softly. "Not just the diner, but everything. The soul of it." Sophie shook her head, overwhelmed. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "That's why I will." And just like that, the wind shifted. Not the kind that bends trees or howls through alleyways, but the kind that moves people. Quiet, lasting, eternal. They began reconstruction the very next morning. It wasn't loud or flashy. There were no camera crews, no media circus, no announcements to the world. Elliot Brand didn't want attention. He wanted restoration. The work was quiet, respectful, almost sacred, like rebuilding a place of worship. Sophie watched from the counter, arms folded across her apron, unsure how to absorb it all. She helped where she could, painting, cleaning, serving coffee to the workers. She didn't ask for much, only that the spirit of the place stay intact. That was all she had ever wanted. Elliot kept returning. Every morning, he'd sit on the same bench with a cup of black coffee, this time bought, not gifted, and they would talk. Sometimes about nothing. Sometimes about grief. And sometimes, in the silence, they simply breathed the same morning air. She never treated him like a billionaire, and he never acted like one. That became their silent understanding. But then came the day he asked her to close the diner early. Sophie looked up, brow furrowed. The place had just started humming again. People were trickling in, curious, grateful, respectful of the new energy that had taken root. She didn't want to disappoint them, but Elliot's expression held something different that day, something tender, uncertain, like a man about to hand someone the truth they hadn't dared to imagine. She nodded. They turned the sign to closed at noon. He walked her outside. A sleek black car waited at the curb, not the limousine this time, but something more personal, more intentional. The driver stepped out and handed Elliot a small black box. He opened it and took out a single silver key. "What's this?" Sophie asked, heart suddenly racing. Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her an envelope, thick, elegant, with her name written in graceful script across the front. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a document. Her name. A deed. Full ownership. Not of the diner, but of the entire block. 5 buildings, including her little shop, the vacant lot next door, and 3 more properties stretching toward the corner, enough for her to build something bigger than she had ever dared to dream. Sophie stared at it, lips parted, unable to form words. Elliot finally spoke, softly. "I spent 3 years in silence, surrounded by wealth I no longer believed in. I didn't think anything could bring me back. Then you gave me a sandwich. You gave me dignity. You gave me back my name, without ever needing to know it." He paused, voice thickening. "So, now I give you a piece of what you helped me remember. A world where kindness is capital. Where compassion has real estate. Where good people don't just survive, they build." Tears spilled freely down Sophie's cheeks. She had lived most of her life counting pennies, measuring miracles in cups of coffee and hours of sunlight. She had never imagined something like this, never thought kindness could echo so far, so deep, it would return as something this powerful. She shook her head, still stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it," Elliot said gently. "Say you'll build what you've always dreamed of. A place not just to eat, but to be seen, to be held, to belong." The air between them shimmered, not with sunlight, but with meaning. Sophie held the key like a promise. And at that moment she understood. This wasn't charity. It was recognition of what she had always been, of what the world could be. The grand reopening of the diner wasn't grand in the traditional sense. There were no ribbon cuttings, no flashy signs or celebrity guests. Just a new wooden sign above the door, hand-carved with care, "The Hearth." Beneath it, in smaller letters, the inscription read, "A place to be seen. A place to belong." Word had spread, not through headlines but through hearts. People came not because they were curious, but because they remembered. The woman who once served soup without expecting payment. The man who had once slept outside without a name. The warmth they had created had seeped into the streets, one act of kindness at a time, until the town itself felt different, quieter, gentler, awake. Inside, the diner still smelled of coffee and toast, but something was new. There was a corner library with worn books and children's drawings on the walls. A wall of photographs, no celebrities, just neighbors, customers, friends. The menu had a give-forward board. If you wanted, you could prepay a meal for someone else. The kindness Sophie had once offered in secret was now baked into the structure. Not charity.
Community.
Elliot still came, but never to sit alone. He became a quiet fixture, offering a word here, a joke there. Sometimes he'd help wash dishes. Other times he'd disappear for days. But he always returned. And whenever he did, Sophie greeted him the same way she always had, with a smile that said, "I see you." People often asked Sophie what had changed, how she had come to own half a block, why a former billionaire spent his mornings fixing leaky faucets and wiping tables. But she never gave them the full story. Not out of pride, but reverence. Some stories are meant to be felt more than told. One rainy morning, an elderly man came in soaked to the bone. Sophie handed him a towel, a hot coffee, and a muffin on the house. He hesitated, then asked, "Why are you doing this?" She smiled softly. "Because someone once did it for me." That was the legacy. Not wealth, not buildings, but the slow, persistent echo of kindness. A legacy that couldn't be measured in dollars, only in the softening of shoulders, in the sighs of relief, in the look someone gives when they realize they're no longer invisible. Years later, when Sophie passed on the keys to a young single mother who had once come in desperate and left hopeful, she simply said, "It's your turn now. Keep the hearth warm." And the fire never went out, because kindness, real kindness, is a quiet ember. It doesn't roar or demand attention. It doesn't fade when the world is loud. It waits, glowing softly, in the hearts of those who dare to see, to give, to believe. And when it's passed on, it becomes unstoppable.